I'm Matthew Kerbis, the subscription attorney, and this is Law Subscribed, your dedicated source for all things subscriptions and the law. Thank you to my sponsors. See links to them in the show notes. Everything discussed is only for educational and entertainment purposes. Enjoy the show.
Oh, it's me again? I thought we were gonna go back and forth.
Okay, we go back and forth. Welcome back to another episode in the special joint series between a different practice and Law Subscribed. We're talking about how to run a law firm in 2025. Woo! All right, so we've covered a bunch of topics, and I'm going to leave it vague in case we want to publish this in a different order. And right now, today, what Lauren and I will be discussing is we're going to be talking about like how do we learn things? How did we learn things when we actually what were some of the sources when we decided to pivot, which we've talked about in a previous episode? And what about continuous learning? What about things like are we just learning about legal things? Are we learning about business things? Are we learning about other things? There's so much content out there, and with a young child who's only my only child is about 4, and I'm thinking about, like, what's the most important thing for her to learn in school? It's almost like how to find out what's junk content and what's quality content that's trustworthy. And so, as true solo practice law firm owners, that's what we're gonna be talking about today.
Yeah, it's a really hard distinction, and I think you don't always know because some folks are really good at marketing junk, and then you get into it and you're like, "This isn't very good." So I will preface the entire episode on whether it's what we say or something else that you find, you have to find what works for you, and if you get into something and it's just not resonating or it's not the way you wanna run your practice or you something you just don't like about it, toss it to the side. There are so many other resources out there that it's not going to be the only one. But I don't know, Matthew, for you, but for me, I'll knock out substantive learning pretty easily because I usually just get that through CLEs. I do try and always keep an eye out for like the updates. I don't know if I'm sure they do this in Illinois, right? Like the 2025 updates for tax law and the 2025 updates for estate planning. So always trying to go to those when I can just to stay on top of the legal developments. And then I think I subscribe to, I want to say it's like Law 360, some of those other kind of newslettery resources in the space that will give you some of the updates, particularly if you can find them in your state. That's really nice just to stay on top of things. Do you do anything differently for like the substantive aspect of practice?
Yeah, it's a really important thing that you gotta do, and what the way that I primarily see updates come through is, I've mentioned it before, I'm a Chicago Bar Association member. I'm actually for I think it's the 3rd term, it's kinda crazy to think about. I'm the co-chair we're, like, just in the 3rd term 'cause the first year I was practicing, I was just a member of the Solo Small Firm Practitioners Committee for the Chicago Bar Association, which is kind of like we don't call them sections, we call them committees. And and so I'm big into, like, the Chicago Bar Association. Even though I live in the suburbs now and I have a virtual law practice, I still go downtown at least once a month. Well, they have just when you're a member, one of their member benefits is you are subscribed to Lexology, which is one of these platforms, like these newsletter, like a Law 360 type thing where, they push out updates and changes and you get to select from like, it gets granular with practice areas and industries and different things. And so I have all the ones that might be relevant for me, even some of the ones that are just tangential. And I've set it up in such a way that it gets highlighted at the top for the practice areas I'm actually like engaged with like frequently. And so I see those updates come through. And then if there are no updates, then it just shows me the other practice areas that I've selected. Now, like these things are usually frankly, like big law firms or prominent law firms that are publishing updates about the law for their clients, but it also gets syndicated to lawyers too. And frankly, like sometimes I'll just like send that update to a client that it's relevant for, even though it has like Vetter Price on there. I know they're not going to hire Vetter Price. Like my clients are not going to, they can't afford Vetter Price. So that's the way that I keep up to date with like substantive changes in law. Like oftentimes, like, okay, for Illinois, like, here's all these changes if you're an employer, like that you have to comply with. So that's good to know. And certainly I could be doing the research, but I don't need to because I'm getting it pushed out through something I'm already paying for. via my bar association memberships. I don't know if all bar associations have something like that, but if they do, definitely take advantage of it.
Yeah, that's a real key one. Just always speaks to the competency requirement that we have for our ethics rules. Stay on top of what's going on, stay involved with folks in the space because you'll learn stuff from, other practitioners. That part feels easier to me because I just kind of set it and forget it and make sure that I read those updates when they come through. But the ones that I really love and I've had hit or miss experiences with is more on the business side of kind of
Mhm.
keeping up with what does marketing look like in 2025? What are the tools and the practices that are going to get the most impact, where you're going to get the most eyeballs, you'll get the ROI, right? Is pay per click working anymore? Do we all need to be on Twitter? Those kinds of questions. That's the stuff I really love. So I have a couple of resources that I have learned a lot from. They may not be super relevant in 5 years from now because things change so fast, but for right now, I really learned about how to run my business better by sticking up with these different resources, but none of them are lawyer focused. I still struggle to find other attorneys talking about how to run a business in a very practical, business forward way other than you, Matthew, right? Like it feels to me like there's few of us. So you may have to look outside of the legal profession to find these more entrepreneurial resources. But the first one that I really love, and I was shared with me recently by a great friend of mine, thanks, Lori, if you happen to be listening, is actually from Justin Welsh. And he is a true solopreneur like us. He does not have any staff, but he publishes this weekly newsletter called the Saturday Solopreneur. And it just gives information about basically how to grow your network or your market. He comes to it from a very general practice. So that again, this is not for lawyers or any specific industry in particular, but his content is so practical and he gives you like, here are the 4 steps to take. Here's the template that you should put into your AI tool to be able to generate some content for your particular business. So I really love his approach and I very much appreciate that he is a true solo, and so he doesn't come with tips that are like, "Oh, make sure that get your staff to do X, Y, and Z." I'm like, "Well, I'm the staff, so I don't need more on my plate than I already have." But that's been a really great resource if you're just looking for these bite-sized, marketing tips and kind of how to grow your audience so that you can reach more folks to hopefully become new clients. That's a fantastic resource. What about you, Matthew? What are some of your business-focused resources?
So just quickly on Justin Welsh, I have not read his stuff for a while now, for at least a couple of years, but I did used to consume some of that content and found it pretty useful. I did find over time, and this might have been before Saturday Solopreneur, he might have had like a different newsletter or a different thing, is it started to get a little samey for me. So, like there's diminishing returns with some of these, but I still learned a lot. And so just because you wanna like we're gonna be suggesting like podcasts, newsletters, CLE programs or other things. We talked about sunk cost fallacy on one of these episodes. Like, just because like you start listening to something or reading something doesn't mean you have to like stay with it forever. Shout out to friend Sam Malai, by the way, of My Legal Academy and the Law Entrepreneur podcast. He has this technique that he's talked about when he came on Law Subscribed of like, sure, subscribe to a newsletter, sure, subscribe to a piece of technology, just check in so many months. And if you're not still getting value from it, unsubscribe. Right. And so I love that idea. And we're, whenever you get towards the end of the year, I find I just try to unsubscribe literally from everything. And if I'm missing anything, if I actually like remember, like, "Oh, I used to like listening to that podcast, or I used to like getting that newsletter." Like, I will then go resubscribe. So I try to, like, declutter the inbox, declutter the podcast feed with all these things. So having said all that, I mean, like, I listen to This Week in Startups primarily. Like, it's so fascinating to get into that world, and while I'm not I'm not a startup lawyer, like, I don't, like, help startups. Like, I help I like, high growth venture-backed startups, right? But they talk a lot about business and they analyze business and they look at the news from a business perspective. And they've had over 2,000 episodes. And so just living in that world helps get you into the mindset of like what it's like what it's like to be a startup founder because you're hearing from startup founders. And like you and I don't have high growth tech startups, but a lot of those same principles can be adapted to law firms. Like what you said, like there's not a lot of lawyers talking about the business of law. And there's not a lot of business coaches specifically for lawyers that actually know about the legal industry. And so you might as well just learn from the best of the best about the business stuff and just lawyers are smart. I'll pat ourselves on the back here. Lawyers are some of the smartest people I know. You could figure it out. You can figure out how to take this business lesson from some podcast like This Week in Startups, and you can totally apply it to your business and find a way to do so. And because of that, I like to say I'm a tech-powered law firm, or sometimes I'm a tech company that happens to be a solo practice law firm.
Yeah, it's really a mindset shift. I think that a lot of attorneys that I adore and work with really have to make that has to click first. That you are ultimately a business. And yes, it is a profession. And yes, we have a really high standard. And yes, we're doing good in the world. And there's a lot of the ethics to it that we can't forget about. It's not just only for profits and bill, and make as much money as possible. I'm not subscribing to that approach of the legal profession, but we are a business and it always fascinates me that folks will not take really good business ideas because they're outside of the profession when they easily could be applied. You have to run them through that filter of what do we have to do per our ethics rules, right? Is this within the grounds of what we can do? Do we maybe have to tweak it slightly before we implement it into our businesses? But I've gotten just some of the best ideas by looking around and going, wow, I really like how that company marketed that new product, or I like the wording that these folks over here use just to describe their services. How can I tweak that to use it for mine? And you just have to get over that roadblock, mental block, I guess, of like, oh, well, they're not a law firm, so it's not going to work for me. But I love being in just sort of the startup space and the business space because those folks are thinking that way naturally. And it's nice to be able to be pulled into their orbit.
Yeah, yeah, and I should point out, and this will be the second time I've mentioned her, is, Carolyn Elefant, like myshingle.com, right? Like, she's been blogging about this since there were blogs. She's got so many great resources, like, I was maybe even, like, 8 months to a year into my practice when I actually bought her legal closet, and it was super useful, and it was only like 1 or $200, and at that point, I'd spent, like, way more on other tech and stuff. I'm like, "Here's, like, a package that she has for me to, like, have some basic things," and now she's, like, totally revamped all that stuff, and, like, I've taken some of the things that were in that, and I've leveraged some legal AI that I have to just, like, improve upon it because 'cause I'm sure some of it's old. Because that's what I found. I found, like, the ABA, even, like, my local bar association that I love, they their materials they were just out of date. They were pre-pandemic, and, like, it needed to be updated, at least at the time that I was getting going especially, and, like, now I've made content for the bar associations that's, like, more relevant, but I'm not learning from myself. Although I will say, and I just was on an episode for Law Lines, like, Lawyers Who Learn, whatever their new podcast is, and there is something to be said about it. I'm curious to know your perspective on this too, like, learning through teaching, like, learning through teaching others, whether it's through a formal CLE process, whether it's through mentoring, whether it's through being a legal podcast host. Like, I find that just when I talk about the things that I know, like what we're doing right now, like, I actually am learning things too sometimes that I didn't know I know. Like, have you had that experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I love working with other attorneys and teaching. I would love to I've pitched to our local law school multiple times. Have not been accepted yet, but one day I'm going to wear them down. But yeah, I love teaching about this stuff and I do find that. I find that it helps me narrow and really solidify my thought process, but I also love to hear from other practitioners. Like I run my practice the way I run it, you run it the way you run it, but sometimes that overlaps and sometimes it's different and you've thought of things I'm like, "Wow, I've never thought of it that way. That's really brilliant," or maybe I should do that. And so being able to work with one another, I like doing it in a teaching capacity, but I'm always learning from the folks that I'm working with in terms of how does their practice area work? Every practice area has its own nuances. How do they want to work? What are their life obligations that they may have that I don't have that we need to consider? But yeah, it is a very fluid approach, I think, and the very traditional stoic one size fits all model, I quickly intuitively realized when I got into practice wasn't going to work for me. But I'm finding I don't think it works for most folks, but nobody gives them the permission to say that to say, "Hey, run your practice like you wanna run it." But yeah, being able to talk with other people, you get so many ideas of things that you didn't think about it that way.
So are you more of like, I'm gonna listen to something, I'm gonna read something, I'm gonna watch something, like, or all of the above? Like, how are you consuming the content to learn the things?
I am more of a reader first and foremost, and then I do listen to a ton of podcasts. And so some of them are more like personal in nature, they're not necessarily for business. But I do anytime, I come across somebody recommends a book or I see that there's a new book out about how to market or how to be better at sales or be a better communicator, I'm always adding it to my Goodreads to be read list, which just grows and grows and grows. But then I do love podcasts. I think that they're such a great way to consume bite-sized content, and so my 2 favorite ones that are for business related things are the Business Made Simple podcast and then Online Marketing Made Easy. Again, 2 different approaches. Business Made Simple takes a little bit more of a 10,000-foot view in terms of running a business. They do have some, like, sales and marketing episodes on there, but they're really focused on making sure that your message is really clear, getting out products, how to create products and services for your target market. So I really get a lot of value out of that. And then Online Marketing Made Easy is certainly just about marketing. But again, growing that audience, being able to really add value, which I think a lot of lawyers struggle with, is marketing. It should not feel salesy in that sense. It should just be a conversation, but it should be a way that you show potential clients the value you provide. And so just kind of finding new and creative ways of doing that, getting ideas for lead generators that you can put together, how to nurture your newsletter list once you get somebody who might be a little bit interested in working with you or some of the services that you're offering, but not ready to sign up, right? How do you continue to nurture that relationship? That podcast is really great. Amy Porterfield is wonderful in the business that she has built. And I always appreciate folks, like you just said, Matthew, who sort of who are teaching from what they know and are in the trenches with you. And so I always get that feeling from Amy Porterfield, who's the host of Online Marketing Made Easy, that she has tested these theories out herself and is only going to talk about the ones that really work and how you can implement them. But yeah, I'm a big podcaster. It's what I go to the gym every morning and pop on an episode and as I'm moving and a million ideas are coming to mind. And so I always love that. That always gets me energized. What about you? Are you a reader, listener, watcher?
Yeah, so I mean, I definitely, like, read some newsletters, right? And, like, one of the ones that comes to mind, in addition to my shingle, is another great female attorney, Laura Frederick, and she has the How to Contract platform. And sort of and now I'm thinking like, "Oh gosh, like, maybe I have to, like, record a series with her too." Although her audience is, like, way bigger than mine. But in any event, I read her newsletter, and it's phenomenal, right? Like, there are, like, bite-sized things. It doesn't take a lot of time to, like, read it and learn. And as a deal lawyer, as a fractional GC, like, that's a super relevant, like, type of content for me, and look, I'm kind of on the fence about taking some of her courses, like, I might, like, if, like, I have an upcoming big deal or something that I need to do that I've like, it's in some new space that's kind of related to what I do, like, it's not CLE, but, she's got a great track record, and she has free and paid offerings, right, to folks, so that's something to look into, but, like, most of the time, I prefer to consume it by listening, like, I'm reading so much for work, like, I'm redlining contracts, and I'm, like, reading updates in law and, like, reading so many other things that my only way to consume that is reading. So, if there is, like, a newsletter or even, like, a Lexology update sometimes, if I could open it in Safari, I'm an iPhone user, and while I love Chrome because 'cause I'm a Google Workspace, person, like, I love Chrome generally, in Safari, on an iPhone running the most up-to-date software, you can have the page read to you by whatever voice you've set for Siri, and I have, like, a nice female British voice. It's much better than the default Siri. No, not trying to throw shade on the woman who provided that voice. So, like, having, like, an article read to you by, like, a nice, like, British lady is actually phenomenal. I just consume that a little bit better, and so highly recommend to that. Big podcaster too, just, like, looking at I never use my podcast app on my computer, but I opened it up. I'm an Apple Podcast, I'm a Mac user, and it's all alphabetical. And so literally the 3rd podcast in this list is a different practice, just so you know, Lauren. Okay.
Yay, I picked a good name.
Yes, you did. You used the phone book method. It starts with A. And D is pretty close, right? So the only one that's in front of you Well, there's one that's called Age of Miracles by Packy McCormick, and he has a great newsletter, though I unsubscribed because it started to become not relevant, and he hasn't updated his podcast since January of 24. But the next one there is A Bit of Optimism by Simon Sinek.
Great
Are
one.
you a s do you like Simon Sinek in general? Like,
Mhm.
I yeah, I consume pretty much everything he puts out. Although I recently finished listening to on Audible, The Infinite Game.
So good.
So good, but I also was like, I'm consuming all of his content, I kind of already knew all this stuff. Like, maybe I didn't need to download the book. But it's so good. Another one, the A16Z podcast is an Andreessen Horowitz, right? Another venture capital firm. I've got the Acquired podcast on there. I've got Be That Lawyer. I'm skipping through some that are like that don't frequently publish. Capital Isn't, which is out of the Polsky Center of the Booth School for the University of Chicago. They don't I think they don't publish super frequently, but they have some really great content. I have some of my podcasts that I have on there. I've Ditching Hourly with Jonathan Stark, it was episode 99 for Law Subscribed, and who curiously sounds a lot like the male voice for Google Notebook LM, if you've ever used that to create a podcast or create an audio thing of a document. I think they might owe him some royalties. I've got Everything Except the Law, which I've done some guest hosting for. I've got Exponential Wisdom, which is a really good one. Financially Legal by it used to be Gravity Legal, now they're Confido Legal. So they have a podcast. They don't publish a lot, but they've had a few episodes recently. I've got the Fixable podcast. I have a lot of TED and NPR podcasts. Let's just leave it that way. Let me see if there's anything else that's like relevant for this audience. Love me some Hidden Brain. I mean, like, that's like if you haven't listened to Hidden Brain, it's the way that, like, people like, the way our minds work and the way people tick, and it's also a lot of, like, introspection and personal things, so, like, self-improvement in addition to just business improvement, right? We can't just think about our work and our clients and our business, personal stuff too. How I built this, which they're actually kind of publishing tons of content, and, like, I'm thinking about pausing my subscription on there and, like, unsubscribing because it's kind of too much right now. Impact Pricing, huge if you're thinking about not billing by the hour. Mark Stiving, episode 56 of Law Subscribed, still like one of my best guests. And it was not even close because he's a pricing expert. And like, if you want to not bill by the hour, you should be consuming all of his stuff. And he's got a bunch of books out there too. I haven't read the books, but I listen to the podcast and he does something really interesting. Maybe as legal podcasters, you and I should have some takeaways here. Is he does something called a blogcast where he used to do it. Now one of his team members does it. They just read one of the blogs as a short podcast episode. They're like 3 to 5 minutes. And every time I see that come up in, like, my feed, I just said, "Oh, yeah, 3, 5 minutes? Psh, I listen at 2 times speed. I'm gonna play that next." So I think there's something to that. Um,
Yeah, that was
then
gonna be my question as you're looking through the rest of your list here is there are a lot of great options out there, and sometimes I wanna go add all of these, and then I'm like, "When am I gonna find the time to do it?" So I'm curious, I listen to mine faster, I don't quite do 2x, my brain does not work that fast, but I do it at, like, 1.2 or 1.5, especially some hosts are, like, a little bit slower talkers, so 1.5 gets the job done. I try and do it when I'm doing something else, like if I'm at the gym anyway, when I go for a walk, if I'm driving in the car, but I don't we're virtual, like, law firms, right? I'm not out and about that much. So I'm curious, when do you find time to listen, and how do you listen in a way that you're able to consume a bunch?
yeah, it's a great question, but I just wanna make sure I get 2 more for the
Yeah, oh,
listeners to
yeah.
add to their list, right? Law Entrepreneur, which is a good one, and The Soul of Enterprise. So I'll leave it there, and I only got down to the T's, so there are a few more. That's pretty much the end of my list. I have Adam Grant's podcast on there too because
Mm,
he's another great thought leader.
yes.
So, having said all that, like, if I see the title of I do kind of rely on the title of episodes because if, like, a title of an episode is, like, something that's because I also subscribe to Legal Talk Network, and so if it's, like, not a topic that I'm gonna benefit from, like, a learning perspective and look, I didn't mention, like, some not some just entertainment podcasts that I have. I subscribe to a couple of them, and I'll skip those too sometimes. You gotta work in some entertainment, right? All work and no play and all that, whatever that line is. I'll just mark them as played. So, like, I don't feel the need to listen to every single episode that comes through, so that's one of the ways that I manage the backlog is it's like, "You know what? Just gonna mark that as played," and then it's off my list. Also, I make it so only the last 2 weeks worth of episodes even show up, and so if it's an older episode and I didn't put it up in my queue, wasn't important enough. I'm not going to listen to it. It's not a big deal, right? I have other important things to do. I am in charge of the child for drop off and pickup, being that I'm the solopreneur who can build in more flexibility into my schedule. And so when I'm driving to pick her up, when I'm driving back from having dropped her off, I get in some good podcast listening there because that's like 20 minutes each way in the car, depending on traffic. And then, like, I try to really share in household duties, right? So, like, if I'm doing the laundry, if I'm making dinner that night, like, I just, my wife knows, just like, that's my podcasting time to like just tune into a podcast and make dinner. Like, after sometimes my kid kicks me out of the bedtime routine and she just wants to cuddle with mommy because she sees me for drop up, she sees me a lot more than mommy. And so, like, that's some time for me to go chill and like listen to a podcast, right? So, like, really, I fill all my empty space listening to a podcast because I really focus on time blocking my day for the workday and just trying to get substantive work done. What I have found is sometimes it's good if your schedule allows, mine doesn't always, to build in like just some like unstructured time. I'm going to block an hour, this day at this time during this week to just like not do anything. And maybe I'll get in 2 or 3 podcasts during that session of just like lying down, relaxing, catching up on, some papers, which I don't know how I have so many papers. Like I'm a virtual digital law firm, but like I get things from the village and I get like so much paper still. So like getting through like a bunch of paper that is piled up on my desk to scan some things and like listen to a podcast while I'm scanning and, like, sometimes with the podcast editing too, Lauren, is I know like, I don't necessarily need to listen to a podcast to edit it anymore because I've edited over 100 podcasts. I probably edited close to 200 considering my non-law subscribed podcast that I know to, like, just, like, okay, delete all the ums and ahs, look for, like, certain things, like, change some things around. Like, I make notes during the interview to, like, "Oh, there was a pickup there," or edit that out there. And, like, I don't need to listen verbatim to every line that was said when editing an episode, so I'll literally listen to a different podcast while I'm mindlessly editing my podcast. That's another play time that I do it, which is kind of like I mean, it's podcast on top of podcast. It's crazy to hear me say it out loud, but yeah, that's something that I do.
That's incredible, I could not do that. My brain is not wired to that way, but I do like your idea of finding ones that are little bits of content, little nuggets, little digestible pieces. I think I might try and incorporate that into a different practice because I do struggle sometimes. There's one that I love, and this has nothing to do with the law, but I always find the conversation so interesting. It's at the Huberman Lab, and it's a neuroscientist out in Stanford, and he just has these really in-depth wonderful conversations, but the episodes are 2 hours long. Like, and I'm like, I don't have that kind of time. So speeding them up, but also looking for ones that are, going to work with you where when you do have 20 minutes here and there on a drive to be able to fit those in, I think you can get a lot of really great ideas. I will say not while you're driving, of course, but I use Notion to just sort of brain dump stuff that I think about because my brain is thinking of ideas all the time. And I always have that up and ready when I'm listening to a podcast because I'll get an idea and I'll want to write down, oh, do a newsletter about this. Or maybe you should start doing, 3 to 5 minute podcast episodes. I'm going to write that down. So if you are somebody who kind of gets ideas from all different spaces, make sure you've got a spot to put them because you'll go on with your day and forget about them. But there is such a rich treasure trove of information out there.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the idea with this series, right? Is 30 minutes or less, some really useful content if you're thinking about or are running a law firm in 2025. So thanks again for tuning in to this episode. That's
So
it's
good.
it's a good place to leave it, right?
Yeah, I love it.
Okay.
Brilliant.
And that's a wrap. Thanks for tuning in. Make someone's day by sharing this episode with them. The best way to get in touch is to follow and message me on LinkedIn. To get extra content, subscribe to the newsletter at www.lawsubscribe.com, where you can also become a paid subscriber to get episodes and content early. Until next time, this is Matthew Kurbis with Law Subscribed.